Welcome to our literacy webinar series. My name is Amanda Clary, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Secondary and Supplemental Literacy. We are so very excited to have Jim Cummins here today with us to share with you some of his research and best practices dealing with the untold science of reading. However, before we get started, I would like to make a special announcement. You may have noticed a different logo at the top of our screen. That's because we are proud to announce that as of today, the K-12 sector of Pearson now has become Savvis Learning Company. It's still all the same great products you know and love. However, we are now our own separate standalone company. Look for more exciting announcements to come. So our goal with this webinar series is to help educators and students alike adapt to the challenges of distance learning. We've assembled a dedicated team of authors and experts to share best practices, strategies, and resources during these unprecedented times. Dr. Jim Cummins is a professor emeritus in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at the University of Toronto. His research and work is recognized all over the world and focuses on literacy development in multilingual schools context, as well as on the potential roles of technology in promoting language and literacy development. In recent years, he has been working actively with teachers to identify ways of increasing the literacy engagement of learners in multilingual school contexts. Dr. Cummins is an author of many books and on multiple Pearson programs, including My Perspectives, English Language Arts, and My View Literacy. However, before I turn it over to him, I just have some quick housekeeping items to mention. Each of you should have a control panel that looks like this. At the end of Jim's presentation, he will have a chance to answer some of your burning questions. Since there are over 300 of you guys on the webinar today, your lines are all muted. However, you can type in your questions into the question field shown here on the screen at any time during the presentation, and Jim will do his best to answer as many as he can. To ensure you're connected to audio, check the audio section of your attendee panel and also ensure you have the computer audio selected and the correct output selected as well. I've put the call-in number in the question field if you can't connect to audio via your computer. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jim.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me personally welcome you to the webinar today. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm very, very happy to talk about what we need to know about reading in order to help students to succeed academically. I'll just give you a little bit of background about my own work initially. The research that I've done over the past 40 or so years has focused on two main areas. First of all, how can schools promote academic achievement amongst English language learners? And a broader formulation of that question is, how can we reverse underachievement among students who are experiencing difficulty and at danger of or risk of not graduating? And a second theme that's run through a lot of the work I've done is to look at what's the nature of academic language and how does it relate to literacy development? So what are the relationships between language in general and language development in particular, and the development of reading and writing skills? And one of the distinctions that I've made that many of you may be familiar with is to highlight the fact that there are major differences between conversational fluency in a language and the development of academic language proficiency. And this applies to both students who are monolingual students and we're talking about their first language, as well as to students who are learning English or other languages as a second language. And one of the core elements of this distinction is to ask, well, where do we find academic language? And basically, we find academic language in two places. We find it in classrooms and we find it in print. And this, the logic underlying this reality is something that I'll come back to throughout the presentation. Another research finding that I was able to highlight is the fact that when we look at the trajectories of English language learners catching up academically, we're typically looking at a much longer period of time for them to catch up than it takes them to develop reasonably good conversational fluency in everyday face-to-face situations. So a student may appear to be relatively fluent in English after 1 or 2 years, but the research shows that we're looking at typically at least 5 years and sometimes much longer for students to bridge the gap. The photograph on the left-hand side of your screen goes back more than 25 years. Those are 2 of my kids. And it highlights, I think, a key insight that I want to try and communicate. And that's the fact that literacy development and the expansion of language is very much a socialization process as much as it is an instructional process. And I'll come back to that point later on in the webinar. So the major point that I want to make is that literacy engagement is a key determinant of reading comprehension. There's a logic underlying this, there's an extensive amount of research, and we need to look at what the policy implications of that are. So the logic is what I said before, that academic language is found primarily in printed text rather than in everyday conversation. We don't find a lot of academic language in everyday conversation. When we used to be able to go to restaurants and cafes and bars, a lot of that is conversational language. We're not experiencing that anymore, but we're looking at a very different form of the language that we use in textbooks, in classrooms, and in instruction compared to what we experience in everyday face-to-face situations. And so students' opportunities to broaden their vocabulary knowledge and develop strong reading comprehension skills are likely to be greatly enhanced when they have abundant access to printed texts and engage actively with these texts. I'll talk about some of the research that underlies this. There's an extensive amount of research that supports this conclusion. At the end of the PowerPoint, there are 2 slides that have a lot of the research that relates to this listed in there in terms of the references. And the context for this in terms of policy is that over the past 20 years, the findings of the National Research Panel have been misinterpreted and or distorted, initially in the context of the policies that were put in place under No Child Left Behind and the Reading First program that was part of that was focused on helping low-income students develop strong literacy skills in the early years. Those are noble aspirations, but unfortunately, a lot of the relevant evidence was ignored in the implementation of Reading First, and so it didn't meet its goals. So as a result, we continue to misinterpret the real causes of the stagnation of reading scores in grade 4 and 8. And this was documented most recently by the National Assessment of Educational Progress report that came out in 2019. There's a quote there from an article in Education Week that highlighted the findings of that report. It says reading performance has dropped significantly among both 4th and 8th graders since the last release 2 years ago. So I want to look at what are some of the reasons for that and what can we do about it. So I've organized the webinar into 4 parts. So the first part gives a brief outline of how what a lot of people have called the reading wars are currently being reignited with the same, what I would say is evidence-free and problematic arguments that have been discredited over the past 20 years. The second part looks at what the National Reading Panel actually found. If we're looking at the science of reading, then we've got to go back and look at what exactly did the National Reading Panel find in its report. And it endorsed both a focus on systematic phonics instruction, but also it strongly endorsed a balanced literacy approach. So creating an artificial opposition between those two is highly problematic. Part 3 will look briefly at the extensive evidence supporting the fact that literacy engagement has a causal role in promoting reading comprehension. And then the final part will look at some of the work that I've tried to do in terms of looking at how we can mobilize the whole school on the same wavelength to implement instructional policies and practices that have evidence supporting their power to push back underachievement or reverse underachievement. So that's where I'm going to go, and there's a lot in here, so I'll go through it fairly quickly, but you will have access to the PowerPoint fairly quickly after the webinar, so you'll be able to read anything that I skip over at your own time. So let's look at what's happened in the last couple of years, where many of you may be familiar with the term the science of reading. And this movement came about largely through the catalyst of Emily Hanford, who's a journalist, a commentator in American public media. And she wrote some very influential podcasts and articles, one of which is called Hard Words: Why Aren't Kids Being Taught to Read? And there's a couple of quotes there from that article that highlight some of the points that she wants to make. She says, the sum of the national, that should be NRP, not NPR, the sum of the National Reading Panel research showed that explicitly teaching children the relationship between sounds and letters improved reading achievement. The panel concluded that phonics lessons helps kids become better readers. And then she goes on to talk about balanced literacy. And she quotes somebody who argued that balanced literacy was a way to defuse the wars over reading. It succeeded in keeping the science at bay, and it allowed things to continue as before. So in other words, there's an opposition being created between what she sees as being a scientific approach, namely explicitly teaching sound symbol relationships, and her interpretation of what balanced literacy entails. Just another example of what's been published in recent years. There's an article by a person called Dana Goldstein from a couple of months ago in the New York Times that reviews this debate. It's called The Old and Contested Solution to Boost Reading Scores, namely phonics. And the subheading is, as test scores lag, there's a growing debate between proponents of the science of reading, which emphasizes phonics, and traditional educators who prefer to instill a love of literature. Again, we're setting up an us versus them orientation there, which I'm going to argue is very problematic. A quotation from that article is there. It says, the science of reading stands in contrast to the balanced literacy theory that many teachers are exposed to in schools of education. That theory holds that students can learn to read through exposure to a wide range of books that appeal to them without too much emphasis on technically complex texts or sounding out words. Now, when I read articles like this that create this opposition, I get very concerned, because my understanding of balanced literacy is totally different from the way they've been depicted in articles like those that I mentioned. One of the most robust orientations or understandings of reading goes back a long way to an article by Goff and Tunmer called where they talked about the simple view of reading. And this basically said that reading comprehension is the combination of decoding and language comprehension. So in order to understand what we're reading, we need to be able to decode well, but we also need to understand the vocabulary that's in the text. We need to be able to understand the grammatical organization of the text and how it's organized from a discourse point of view. And there's the same article in Education Week that talked about the drop in reading scores, also talked about the simple view of reading. And I'll quote, or I'll paraphrase some of what it says. It says, the simple view of reading says there are two essential components of reading comprehension: decoding ability and language comprehension. Comprehension is the product of those two things, meaning if either one is low, the student won't be able to comprehend well. So my understanding of a balanced literacy instructional approach is that it focuses equally on ensuring that all students develop strong decoding skills, and also that they continue to expand their language development through the preschool and school years. And one of the things that the research is saying very clearly to me, and I hope I'm able to communicate this, is that what some people have called literacy saturation or literacy engagement is a crucial element in developing students' language comprehension from the face-to-face language skills that we develop through interaction through the early grades of school, where we expand students' vocabulary knowledge and their understanding of language, their awareness of how academic language works, into broader spheres. So there was a response, or a partial response, to the some of the claims of folks who are promoting the science of reading from the International Literacy Association. You can look this up on their website. But this is the first paragraph from that article. And it says, in the last year, there's been a resurgence of articles and reports in media outlets such as New York Times, PBS, NewsHour, EdWeek, etc., about students experiencing reading difficulties. And many of these pieces have created confusion and provided misinformation by oversimplifying both the sources of reading difficulties and how to address them. And so some articles have reignited old debates, often referred to as the reading wars, etc. So basically what that article is saying is pretty much what I try to express in terms of the simple view of reading, that decoding is incredibly important. Phonics is a major component of how we develop decoding skills, but it's not the whole story when we're looking at the development of reading comprehension. We have to also continually expand students' development of language, their ability to use language, to express concepts, to express ideas, to inquire about issues in the world. And that requires more than just phonics. So let's move to part 2, and let's do a reality check. The National Reading Panel is invoked pretty much by all sides in this debate. So let's look at some of the things that it actually found. And I'm drawing here on an article that I wrote more than 10 years ago that came out in a journal called Educational Researcher, called Pedagogies for the Poor. And I looked at some of what the National Reading Panel actually found and what the researchers who were part of that panel actually said about balanced literacy. So the National Reading Panel found that for normally achieving and for low achieving readers, systematic phonics instruction showed no relationship to reading comprehension beyond grade 1. It did show a relationship to reading comprehension for students who are experiencing reading difficulties. And one of the reasons for that, obviously, is that students who are classified as experiencing reading difficulties have problems decoding. But for low achieving and normally achieving readers, there was systematic phonics instruction rapidly reached a point of diminishing returns. And the 4 of the panel members, Airy, Nunes, Stahl, and Willows, all very highly respected researchers, acknowledged this pattern. And these are just a couple of quotes from their long article that talked about the findings of the National Reading Panel. They said, amongst the older students in 2nd through 6th grades, phonics instruction was not effective for teaching spelling or for teaching reading comprehension. Another quote is, readers in 2nd through 6th grades classified as low achieving revealed no overall effects of phonics instruction. This is what the National Reading Panel actually reported. So, you know, they titled their article in the Review of Educational Research as Systematic Phonics Instruction Helps Students Learn to Read. Well, that's clearly true. But it could just as accurately have said systematic phonics instruction after grade 1 does not help students develop reading comprehension unless they are experiencing reading decoding disabilities. Now, let me emphasize here, I'm not arguing against phonics instruction. Phonics instruction is core. Every reading program, or every reading program that I've seen over the last 15 or more years has a strong phonics component, and they should have. What I'm saying is that there needs to be also other things involved in promoting reading comprehension. There's also the importance of looking at what the National Reading Panel said about balanced instruction, because they take a very different approach to the approach that has been put forward by some of the advocates of so-called science of reading. Because in addition to highlighting the importance of phonics instruction, the National Reading Panel also strongly advocated balanced approaches to reading. and they rejected any opposition between systematic phonics instruction and engagement with authentic texts. And there's a few quotations here. Systematic phonics instruction should be integrated with other reading instruction to create a balanced reading program. They advocated the use of high quality literature and cautioned that phonics should not become the dominant component in a reading program, neither in the amount of time devoted to it, nor in the significance attached. They also expressed concern about the commonly heard call for intensive systematic phonics instruction and drew attention to some of the potential negative effects of scripted programs. They said, although scripts may standardize instruction, they may reduce teachers' interest in the teaching process or their motivation to teach phonics. So basically, the National Reading Panel is endorsing an approach similar to the basic point that the Simple View of Reading is saying. We need phonics and we need decoding, but we also need a balanced approach that highlights the importance of expanding students' language development as they grow through the preschool years into the elementary school years. Now, when we look at what happened, going back again almost 20 years, again, this was with the best of intentions in terms of No Child Left Behind. The Bush administration funded a program called Reading First. There was $6 billion allocated for that. But the Reading First program, or the panel members who decided which programs or which school districts got funding and which didn't, took a very narrow view in terms of what they regarded as scientifically based reading instruction. And Reading First spent $6 billion to produce very, very little. The impact study that looked at what impact it had came up with the following conclusions. Reading First didn't produce a statistically significant impact on student reading comprehension test scores in grades 1, 2, or 3. It produced a positive and statistically significant impact on decoding among first grade students tested in one school year, and it had no statistically significant impacts on student engagement with print. So why did it fail to improve reading achievement? I'm not going to go into any detail here, but basically the early reading programs that the Reading First panel judged to meet the criterion of scientifically based reading research all had to incorporate an intensive focus on sequential phonics instruction, where all the major rules were taught systematically and explicitly throughout the primary grades and frequently throughout elementary school. And any program that they judged to be balanced or to be tainted with whole language assumptions was not funded. There's a quotation there from the director of Reading First. It's from an email to a staff member, and I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself. It doesn't make for very pleasant reading, but it highlights, I think, the ideological orientation that was infused in the judgment of what was scientifically based reading instruction. Okay, let's move on to the third part. I want to look at what the research is saying about literacy engagement being a central element in promoting reading comprehension. The photograph you see on the left-hand side of your screen is of John Guthrie, who's a very eminent cognitive psychologist who works out of the University of Baltimore or University of Maryland in Baltimore. And he's done a lot of research focusing on the impact of reading engagement and more broadly literacy engagement on the development of reading skills. Now, what he means by literacy engagement is up on the top of the screen there. We're talking about the amount and range of reading and writing. We're talking about the use of effective strategies for deep understanding of text. And these are my terms rather than his. We're talking about positive affect or motivation, and what I and other people might call identity investment in reading and writing. So students are going to engage much more if they are enjoying reading, if reading is fun, and if they're getting something out of it personally. And he notes that in all spheres of life, for example, driving a car, doing surgery, playing golf, gourmet cooking, whatever, participation is key to the development of proficiency. And he says, certainly some initial lessons are valuable for driving a car or typing on a keyboard, but expertise spirals upward, mainly with engaged participation. And his point is that reading and writing are like that. We need some help to get into them, to understand the rules of the game, but then we've got to learn, we've got to expand our skills and our abilities by doing. And I think that's a point that's familiar to all of us who've tried to acquire any kind of a skill. So if we look at the empirical case for literacy engagement as a primary determinant of achievement, again, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but when we look at the differences between texts and everyday conversation, there's a study that was carried out by a person called Massaro, where he looked at picture books intended for children in the early grades, and he found that they contained almost twice as many sophisticated or rare words compared to the speech that adults direct to children or speech between adults. So basically, if we want kids to get access to sophisticated concepts, sophisticated vocabulary, to the kind of grammatical constructions that we use in academic texts, they need to be exposed to books. So children who experience less access to print at home and school have less opportunity to expand their vocabulary knowledge and develop familiarity with other aspects of academic language. There's a lot of research showing that students from low-income backgrounds experience significantly less access to written language in their homes, schools, and neighborhoods than is the case for higher-income students. And then there's a lot of research that you can look up yourself in the references that are at the back of the PowerPoint, showing that there's a causal relationship between literacy engagement and literacy achievement for both native speakers and second language learners. Again, to come back to John Guthrie, he cites the what's called the PISA research. This is the Program for International Student Assessment. And these are large-scale studies involving hundreds of thousands of students, involving at this point more than 70 different countries, carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And these data consistently show that students whose family background was characterized by low income and low education, but who are highly engaged readers, substantially outscored students who came from backgrounds with higher education and higher income, but who themselves were less engaged readers. Based on a massive sample, this finding suggests the stunning conclusion that engaged reading can overcome traditional barriers to reading achievement, including gender, parental education, and income. Let's look at the preschool years. There's an interesting study carried out by researchers in New Zealand where they looked at characteristics of preschool environments or early childhood education environments and followed students through their schooling up to the age of 16 to look at what characteristics of the preschool environment predicted achievement in adolescence. And what they found was that a variable that they called print saturation emerged as being highly significant. And they described the early childhood education centers in the following way. They said that an ECE center that achieved the highest possible rating for print saturation would be very print focused. It would encourage print awareness in children's activities, have a lot of printed material visible around the center at children's eye level or just above, and offer children a range of readily accessible books. A center that scored the lowest possible rating would have no print evidence at all, no books, posters, or other forms of writing. So what they're saying here is not that we should be formally teaching reading, but they're saying that reading and the development of literacy is very much a socialization process, where kids who are surrounded by books, where they have adults reading books to them, develop insights and awareness about print that primes them to develop strong reading skills later on. What they found was that at age 10, for children from low-income homes, there was a difference of 18 percentage points in reading comprehension between those who attended the least and most print-saturated early childhood environments. At age 14, students who had attended a non-print focused early childhood environment scored 12 to 15 percentage points lower than the 3 other quartile groups who had experienced greater print saturation. So when we talk about the simple view of reading and the importance of language comprehension, we're not talking only about instruction in the elementary years. We're talking about creating preschool print environments that build up students' awareness of how print works. And this is incredibly important when we think about quality in early childhood education. If we go back to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's PISA studies, the first point there basically says the same as what John Guthrie said, but the bottom bullet I think is really interesting. One of the things they found was that there was about a 1/3 overlap between the negative impact of low socioeconomic status, low income, low parental education, and the positive effect of reading engagement. So what this implies is that schools can, in principle, can significantly reduce the negative effects of low socioeconomic status by strongly promoting literacy engagement. More specifically, we could push back about 1/3 of the negative impact of low socioeconomic status if we got kids actively engaged with literacy from an early age. That's a huge potential impact. And yet, when we look at the way the National Research Panel was interpreted by the Reading First researchers, and more recently by some of the people who've been creating this artificial opposition between a phonics approach and a balanced literacy approach, we see no mention of literacy engagement, despite the enormous research that's out there focusing on its importance. So the bottom line here, it's obviously essential to develop students' ability to decode written language, and phonics instruction is an important part of that process. However, knowing how to decode doesn't directly lead to reading comprehension. Decoding is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is much more directly related to the degree to which students get actively engaged with reading, and I would add writing is also important. So what this means is that a focus on literacy engagement should start at the preschool level. For example, listening to and dramatizing stories. And this should happen long before any formal decoding or reading instruction takes place. And literacy saturation is particularly important for low-income students who may have experienced relatively little print access in the home. Okay, moving on to the last part. And I'm going to step back and broaden the focus here. What do we need to do to reverse underachievement? And a starting point for this, a logical starting point that I don't believe has really been promoted to any great extent, is to ask ourselves, well, who are we talking about when we talk about underachievement? Which groups of students systematically underachieve? And obviously students who have special education needs are going to underachieve, but that's an individual issue, a cognitive issue usually. But if we exclude students with special education needs, there are 3 groups of students that in many countries show systematic and consistent patterns of underachievement. One group are students from linguistically diverse backgrounds. Students from low socioeconomic backgrounds also systematically underachieve compared to students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And then students from socially marginalized communities tend to underachieve. These are communities that have experienced exclusion and marginalization, and often explicit or overt racism, often over generations in many countries. We can look at indigenous communities, Native American communities, for example. In the United States, we can look at African American communities. We can look at Latino communities. Okay, why did they underachieve? What are the causal factors operating? And then what do we know about high impact evidence-based educational interventions that are available? Now, what this slide is saying, and I'm just going to mention it briefly, is that different groups of researchers have looked independently at these 3 areas. So issues related to linguistically diverse students have been addressed by researchers focused on bilingual education and teaching English as an additional language. Issues related to socioeconomic status have been addressed by a different set of researchers, often those concerned with school improvement in general. And then issues related to racialized or marginalized students have been addressed by researchers focused on things like critical pedagogy or culturally responsive or culturally relevant instruction. And so they haven't really come together. And my point is that we need to bring these things together when we're talking about a whole school response to reverse underachievement. So in the slide that you should be seeing in front of you, you can see the three groups that I've talked about. You can see sources of potential disadvantage. I'm calling this potential disadvantage because these factors only become realized as actual disadvantage when the school doesn't implement evidence-based instructional responses. So if we look at linguistically diverse students, obviously if a student comes to school not understanding the language of instruction, then if the school does nothing to help the student gain access to the language, they're likely to have difficulty. If we talk about students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, in the United States, there's a variety of factors that have been highlighted as being relevant. Sometimes inadequate health care and nutrition affecting families that are growing up in poverty. Housing segregation leads to school segregation. And schools can't do very much about a lot of those things, particularly housing segregation. But one other thing that is a strong factor limiting students' potential for academic achievement is a limited access to print that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds often have, both in home, neighborhoods, and in school. And if families are living in poverty, they don't have money to buy books. It's as simple as that. If we look at marginalized students, various kinds of discrimination in the broader society, combined sometimes with low teacher expectations and stereotypes that may exist, lead to a broad pattern of identity devaluation. So if we look at what are the evidence-based instructional responses that have been validated in lots of research. In terms of helping students learn the language of instruction, teachers need to know how to scaffold comprehension and production of language across the curriculum. So it's not just the job of the ESL teacher or the language specialist to do this. All teachers need to know how to do that when they're teaching science, when they're teaching math, when they're teaching other content. There's a lot of research that's been done over the last 10, 20 years that shows that when we tap into and help students use their first languages as cognitive tools, as tools for learning, that can be a very important scaffold also. And then we need to reinforce academic language across the curriculum. So when we're teaching science, we're not just teaching science, we're teaching the language of science. We're reinforcing students' understanding of how to understand the way scientific concepts are expressed. We're helping them understand the genre of writing science reports, etc. Language is infused in all of these subjects, and we need to reinforce it as we're teaching these subjects. When we look at students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, again, we need to reinforce academic language across the curriculum for all the obvious reasons. But the research suggests that we can do a lot to push back on the negative effects of low socioeconomic status and social disadvantage generally, if we can maximize students' access to print and their engagement with literacy from the day they walk into school. And then when we look at students who are coming from marginalized communities, we need to, if we're going to reverse the effects of identity devaluation, we need to affirm identities in the context of instruction. So we need to connect instruction to students' lives. We need to validate their experience. If we're talking about students from Indigenous backgrounds, we need to decolonize curriculum and instruction through culturally sustaining pedagogy. In other words, we need to valorize the experiences, the cultural knowledge, what some people have called the funds of knowledge that students have in their communities. And we need to valorize and build on the language varieties that students have in both their languages. And all of this translates into affirming student identities in association with academic engagement. There's strong research support for all of these components. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. And I'll give you one example here of how creating dual language books is one strategy that can tick off or check off a lot of these evidence-based strategies. This was a in the grade 6 class, the teacher had a varied group of students. Tomer, who wrote this book, had come from Israel. This was his first year learning English, and the teacher wanted to fulfill the broader expectations of the grade 6 curriculum, one of which is creative writing. And so obviously students who are in the early stages of learning English are not going to be able to write very much in English. So the teacher encouraged students to write in their first language and then to find a way to go from that first language to English. So Tomer wrote this story, Tom Goes to Kentucky. And Kentucky there refers to the Kentucky Derby. He wrote it in Hebrew, and there was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew to help him translate that into English. And they talked about the story, and basically he learned how to express his ideas in English as a result of that collaborative translation process. And so when we look at his experience, these are a couple of quotes from him. He says, I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. So he's basically saying that language skills transfer when they're given the opportunity to do so. He goes on to say the first time he couldn't understand what his teacher, Lisa, was saying, except the word Hebrew. But I think it's very smart that she said for us to do it in our language because we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. This is a grade 6 student, and grade 6 students don't like feeling like they're a baby. They don't like feeling incompetent. And so this example illustrates how we can scaffold instruction by engaging students' multilingual repertoire. We can connect to students' lives, we can affirm their identities, we can reinforce academic language and expand literacy engagement by strategies like this. This is just one example. I'm going to go through this here. When we look at the importance of literacy engagement, what you see is there is a photograph of an elementary school library, or one bookshelf in the library, where they have a multilingual collection, and they get extra money because it's an inner city school. More than 90% of the students come from non-English speaking backgrounds. One of the ways they use that extra money is they keep the school library open 4 days a week after school from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 7 o'clock. And so that when parents pick up their kids, they can go into the library, they can sit there, they can read books with their kids in English or in their first language. And this is exactly the kind of intervention that the research is crying out for. Expand students' access to print, expand their parents' opportunities to spend time with them, talking about books, and yet we tend not to do that. When we talk about literacy engagement, we're also talking about identity. And in this same school, I walked around it one day and just took photographs of what was on the walls in the corridors. And in one class, I think it was a grade 5 class, there were all of these little posters that students had created with the sentence starter called "Reading makes me powerful because." So this one was, "Reading makes me powerful because I get smarter and I learn more facts. I learn new words and I'll never forget." Another one was, "Reading makes me powerful because when I grow up, I can find a better job than people who can't read. Somebody can also trick you to do something that will get you into trouble. So if you can't read very well, you're not going to read the small print and you can be cheated." Tasneem goes on to say, "Reading gives you new words to learn. It gives my brain new ideas. It helps your vocabulary. So when you need to write something, you can use longer and harder words. In school, you can get a better mark using more words." Tasneem is probably the CEO of some big multinational corporation right now, because everything she says there is supported by research and it's incredibly valid and important. When we look at devaluation of identity for students from socially marginalized communities, I'm just going to focus in on a quotation there from Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's a very eminent African-American researcher. And she said, again, more than 20 years ago, the problem that African American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. So if that is a major source of underachievement, we need to affirm students' identities. This is a student from what in Canada we call First Nations communities or Native American. She's a high school student. They carried out some projects, art projects and other projects that tried to link up students' identities with instruction. So students wrote poetry, they created art, and just one of the things she said in conversation with us was about identity. She says, take away identity and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think they care about what goes on in the classroom? And so the point here is that if we can get students seeing literacy as part of their lives, identifying themselves as readers and writers, and this is a socialization process that should be happening, ideally should be happening very early. For a lot of middle-class kids, it happens at the preschool level and in the home. Kids who don't have the same kind of access to text in their homes need the school to do it for them a lot. But we need to build up students' sense of books being important and books expanding their identities. Okay, I'm just going to go through this and go to the summary and then wrap it up. So what I'm trying to say here is that teaching students how to decode and identify sound letter correspondence is a crucial element in helping students develop strong literacy skills. However, beyond grade 1, other instructional strategies play a much greater role. Print access and literacy engagement has emerged as a central instructional variable predicting literacy achievement. Its effects are greater even than the effects of socioeconomic status by themselves. We need to, when we look at students from marginalized communities, we need to acknowledge that societal power relations and the way historically they've been reflected in terms of teacher-student identity negotiation. For example, some teachers having low expectations for students from certain groups, that exerts a major effect on the achievement of students from marginalized social communities. And the final point is that maximizing students' literacy engagement and creating opportunities for students to use language in powerful, namely identity-affirming ways are crucial components of effective instruction. So in other words, if we go back to that simple view of reading, we need decoding skills, and phonics are a crucial tool in helping students gain access to decoding skills, but we also need to focus on developing students' language comprehension. And the most powerful way of doing that, of helping students transition and expand their language knowledge from everyday face-to-face interpersonal communication into the very different kinds of academic language that they need, is through literacy engagement, exposing children to books, getting them talking about books, creating what some people have called a literacy club, where there's a community that enjoys reading and enjoys writing. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to trying to answer at least some of the questions that you've got.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim, for those that relevant and informational presentation. That was really awesome. So we are about to take questions for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. However, I just did want to share some reminders with everyone today that if you want to learn more about the SAVIS literacy programs, including getting access to free digital demo accounts, you can go to savis.com/literacy. In addition, we have more free resources for those teachers already using our programs or want to access additional resources to support distance learning. We have free resources available on our website, mysavistraining.com/free remote learning resources, or just go to savisschool.com and click on the orange banner at the top. You'll get access to reading and writing packets, digital novels, and other free resources there with no sign-ins required that you can download right now. So without further ado, we will have a question and answer session, and Pa, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you, Jim. We've actually got a ton of questions from the teachers, some great comments coming in. But the first question, Jim, is from Kathy. How can we help secondary ELs to maintain or progress in reading comprehension while we are in this period of distance learning?
Great question, and one that I think a lot of teachers are asking themselves, a lot of parents are asking themselves. One of the easiest things to get students to do once you can kind of get them once you can kind of get them past the threshold where they will look at this as something relevant, is to read, because reading is enjoyable. And so if we can find, if we can identify books and online materials that are accessible to students, that are at their language level or a little bit beyond, or have supports built in that students can read, then I think one of the things that we can get students to do is to read extensively on issues that are of interest to them. We can, if we can find the literacy or the textual materials, and there's a ton of them on the web, both commercially produced by publishers as well as just general material, then getting students into reading can be something that will promote their continued development of academic language, as I've been trying to say in the webinar. There are also quite a few materials that may be available in students' first languages, and I think we can encourage them to read those books, to bring back information to a discussion group within the class, where they can, for example, look at, say, how something like coronavirus measures are being implemented in their home countries. What are some of the things that people are saying about it? What are some of the discussions going on? They can bring that back into a discussion format for discussion with the teacher and with other students in their class or group. So one of the most obvious things that we can try and push students to do, and hopefully we don't have to push them, because once they get into this can be enjoyable, is to get involved in reading extensively.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Hugh. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Thank you, Jim. We ELL teachers love your work. Can you clarify what systematic decoding looks like or sounds like? Many may rely on a program or strategy.
Yeah, it's one of the things that was, I think, misinterpreted or distorted in the initial reaction to the National Reading Panel. So the National Reading Panel came out in 2000, and over the next couple of years, there was a lot of discussion about what the results were saying. But one of the ways that this was interpreted was the National Reading Panel was supporting the implementation of teacher-centered scripted phonics and programs, one size fits all, that go for multiple grade levels in the elementary school. And as I mentioned in the presentation, they expressed quite a bit of concern about those kinds of programs. And those programs did not fare well in terms of predicting reading comprehension. So my perspective on this is that we make sure that all students develop good decoding skills. I think there are multiple ways to doing it, and individual students will come to school with different experience of print, different knowledge, and we need to encourage them. We need to help find opportunities to demystify sound-symbol relationships, not just in the 15 minutes of phonics instruction or 15 minutes of ELL teaching, but across the curriculum. It's part of developing language awareness. And as I said, every reading program, elementary reading program that I'm aware of has a strong phonics component, and those are fine, because those programs, for the most part, also have a lot of good reading materials embedded in them. And so we do both. It's a both and issue rather than an either or. And I think we should be very wary about people who argue that there's only one way and that phonics is a panacea, and that communicate a very distorted notion of what a balanced literacy program is like. Balanced literacy program teaches decoding skills, but it also focuses on expanding students' awareness of how language works, and it reinforces students' access to language and development of academic language right across the curriculum. So both of those are important. There isn't just one best way to teach phonics. There's a range, there's a continuum, and there should be a continuum because kids are coming in with different knowledge of the language.
Jim, in terms of speaking about the continuum, we actually have a few questions here that actually talk about how long they should be teaching phonics or how often. So Erica is asking, where does phonics program end? She teaches 5th and 6th graders. She's required to teach, phonics K through 3. Shelby is also asking, if phonics instruction isn't effective beyond 1st grade, how do I help my 4th graders who are reading 3 years behind grade level want to read because they are so behind? Another person had asked, how do I teach phonics to middle schoolers?
Yeah, it's again, let me clarify. When students are learning English, or if they have students have, for whatever reason, have not developed a good grasp of decoding skills, we need to teach decoding skills. We need to demystify how the sounds of English relate to the written word. So if a student comes in at grade 4, we need to teach that student, as they're learning English, we need to teach how the sounds of the word relate to the written word. So it's not that phonics should not be taught after grade 1. That's not at all what I'm saying. It's just what the National Reading Panel reported was that in the big picture, when we look at the relationships across variables, for students who are low achieving and for students who are achieving normally, phonics reaches a point of diminishing returns after that point. One of the reasons being that students have, for the most part, have got a good grasp of how phonics works and how decoding works as a result of instruction in kindergarten and grade 1. And after that point, other things click in terms of predicting reading comprehension. So, but if there's any student in grade 2, grade 3, grade 4 that still has difficulties in decoding, that student needs extra help. We need to help that student to understand how the printed word relates to the spoken word. Some of those students may have special education needs or have a reading disability, and they need phonics instruction. But for most students, as they participate in reading, as they read texts that they can get access to, as they become engaged with reading, they will develop their decoding skills further at the same time as they're expanding their overall language. So we have to individualize what we're doing according to what individual students' needs are. And so any of you who are teaching English language learners knows that students come in at any grade level, they come in at different times of the year, and so there's no way that a one-size-fits-all program can be effective in teaching all of those students. So we have to differentiate, and we give students what they need. If a student knows very little English, we need to explain how the English language works. And as we know, English is complicated in terms of its sound symbol relationships. So we help students to acquire that. Part of that may be a formal phonics program. Part of it may be just one-on-one instruction and help that we can get from whatever sources are available. But part of it also is getting students to engage with texts, and that means having students at the same time as they're learning English, at the same time as they're developing knowledge of how the written system relates to the sound system. They need to be listening to texts. We need to be reading texts in English to them. We can explain words that are difficult to pronounce or don't follow the rules, we can explain. So we embed phonics in our instruction as well as teaching it more formally when the situation warrants.
That's wonderful, Jim. I know we're up for time, and unfortunately we couldn't get to all of the questions. There were some great questions, but hopefully this webinar was able to help all of you who participated, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We will be sending out your professional development certificate tomorrow. Also, please do go to savvis.com/my perspectives if you want access to some of Jim's white papers as well as videos. We will send that in the follow-up email. And Jim, I don't know if you have any last words for the teachers before we ended it for tonight.
Yeah, sure. I would just like to express my admiration, my appreciation to all of you for what you're doing. These are obviously incredibly difficult times for everybody, but for students and for teachers, there are particular challenges. My daughter started teaching, her first year teaching this year in a French-English bilingual program. She's teaching grade 5, and she is at this point an expert in Google Classroom and various other kinds of online tools that she never thought she would need. And so the challenges that all of you are facing are very much familiar to me in terms of the challenges that my own daughter has been facing. So congratulations on what you're doing, and I think all of us deserve, or all of you deserve, a really powerful pat on the back, a virtual pat on the back at this point. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope you can join us for other additional webinars. Thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate it as well. And again, the teachers have said how informative and how helpful this is. So we will be posting the recording on the webinar page as well as a copy of the PowerPoint. So please do check that tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.